Hello and welcome to another episode of Voices of the Diaspora. I am your host, Dilemmahos Grigoriadis. Today I'm joined with Alexandros Benis, President of KTE. Alexandros, how are you doing?
I'm good. How are you?
I'm doing swell. I just came back in from a walk. It's finally summer. I don't know officially summer, but it feels like summer. And we're doing good here. New England, another New England W. Big shout out. So we're here to talk a little bit. We're going to be talking about some contemporary issues with Greece. And Alex, why don't you go ahead and just start telling me what's been on your mind about contemporary Greece?
Yeah. Just for some background for everyone who's listening, I've just moved to Greece like as of a week ago. I just moved into my new apartment. I've been setting up furniture and, learning the neighborhood and trying to get ingrained with the sort of patterns of life here. And in some senses, this is something that we've talked about before, but in some senses, Greece is a place where it's very close to achieving what I would consider to be like a Christian, nationalist, patriotic society. And then in other senses, it's really distant from a lot of those things. And I think it's like this odd juxtaposition that maybe a lot of people living in Greece who have like a patriotic worldview or a Christian worldview, maybe they can relate to it because in some ways we see the foundation or perhaps the relics of a very Christian society, which are being pushed into conflict with something which is so liberal and cosmopolitan. And I say liberal sort of in like the old, like the philosophical sense rather than the modern political sense. Something that's very cosmopolitan and something that's just not very Greek in general. And I think that this comes up in a lot of the sort of like culture war issues that Greece is facing today, both with immigration, with same-sex marriage, with the handling of the economy. We just find that Greece is sort of like a walking contradiction in some ways. I don't know, maybe you can relate to that, but that's just something that I've been noticing a lot more here, both in politics, but also in the mindset of the individual people that I talk with.
I think that's absolutely true. And I've certainly noticed that in the time that I've spent in Greece. And I think there's a lot that goes into it. I think some of it's regional, some of it's different, it's generational. Something I've noticed a lot too, some people have an idea about Greece where maybe if they're like a Greek American and they're like, I want to go be somewhere where like the culture is better, is more traditional, and somewhere it's more Orthodox. And then they decide that they want to move to Greece. And there's sort of two responses I've noticed. Some people are like, oh, so true, I want to do the same thing. That's one view. And the other view is people I've heard, they respond and they're like, oh, it's not what you think it is at all. The people there aren't Orthodox. They don't care about Greek culture. It's very modernist. It's very liberal. It's very whatever, word they want to put on it. And they're very pessimistic about the way people are. And they think that you're totally missing out. You have the totally wrong idea if you decide to return.
Yeah.
I think that this is a result of I think every country's like this. There are multiple layers of culture and there's different social groups. There's different geographic regions and stuff. So I don't think either of these people are wrong necessarily. I think their only error is that they're trying to put the entire view onto the whole country.
Yeah, I agree with that as well. And I guess as it relates to KTE, I found that the average Greek diasporan, including myself, before I started spending a lot more time in Greece, we have a particular vision of Greece. And the vision of Greece is typically based on the idea that our grandparents or whoever was probably the last generation born in Greece, whatever sort of values and whatever sort of vision of the country they instilled upon their children and their grandchildren and great-grandchildren. And oftentimes that's something that's very rural. It's very working class. It's very traditional. It's very patriotic and it's very religious. And this is sort of the Greece that exists in the popular consciousness of people abroad. So, when you think of Greece, you think, oh, there's churches everywhere. And again, I'm not talking about, whether or not this is true in some parts of Greece. I'm merely talking about how the average Greek diasporan may think about their country, in the homeland. And so again, we think, churches everywhere, super religious. Everyone is like an extreme patriot or perhaps a nationalist. And maybe they're sort of cynical. Anyway, but again, these sort of competing influences that exist in Greece, where you do have elements of that which exist. You do have elements of rabid patriotism. You have elements of very faithful Orthodox Christianity. And then you also have elements of nihilism, elements of atheism, and elements of pervasive like leftism. And I think, again, these sort of competing influences come to a head in a couple of issues. And there's one that I want to cover in particular, and that is same-sex marriage. Now, this is a really controversial topic, but I do think it's important that we discuss it and sort of get up to speed on the state of play. So I think I want to establish this by saying that I believe, and this is not to get into conspiracy, but I think this is actually real and measurable, that there is a upper level plan for Greece. And what does that really mean? That means is that there are people at the upper echelon of society, the moneyed powers, the moneyed interests, the sort of oligarchic class, the cosmopolitan elite, which want Greece to be turned into something like a resort country, a country where everything is acceptable, where there are no borders, where there are no rules, where there is no culture, where there is no true nation. It's going to be a country like, say, the Maldives or the Bahamas, where anyone can come and start a business, anyone can come on vacation, anyone can come there, rent a villa for a couple of weeks, and you're going to have a good experience. And the reason why the cultural issues are so important to that and why they're so pivotal is because the kind of Greece that exists in the popular consciousness of the diaspora is antithetical to the kind of Greece which is good for business, if that makes sense. So if there are processions of icons going down the street, and if there is a very nationalistic population which isn't really friendly to outsiders, and if you have a people with a strong moral compass, they might disapprove of sort of the cultural impact that tourism has, about clubs being open late, and Mykonos being a hub for gay tourists, and all of these sorts of things. They contradict one another, and they're mutually exclusive. You can't have a super nationalistic Orthodox Christian country and also have a country like the Bahamas. They just don't mesh. And so basically, what we found through, which is publicly available information for the record, is that there was a very concerted effort by the United States and by Europe to try to deracinate the Greek people and distance them from their traditions and distance them from their faith. And so what am I talking about when I say that? Well, we'll get down to it. So I have a timeline here that I'm going to pull up. Bear with me, guys. Okay, so during the Biden administration, in 2021, there were a handful of really significant events that shaped the course of Greek politics, and it eventually led to the legalization of same-sex marriage in Greece. So before we get into the timeline, the first thing that I want to say is that same-sex marriage was not something that was popular in Greece. This was something that was actually overwhelmingly unpopular. Now, even the most positive polls, or the ones that were the most friendly or most optimistic towards the legalization of same-sex marriage, were not the majority. So you won't find a single poll in Greece where the yays outweigh the nays as far as the question of legalizing same-sex marriage is concerned. So I looked, and the most popular poll I could find was 49.8% against the legalization of same-sex marriage and 48% in favor of same-sex marriage. Now, this sounds like it's pretty contentious. It sounds like it's about 50-50. That's a little bit misleading, because if you actually look into the verbiage of how they polled this and how they measured, actually 32% of the people that were polled expressed no objection, and they were counted as people who supported the legalization of same-sex marriage. So actually, the real number is probably around more like 70% against or not concerned with it, and maybe only about 20% which are actually in full support of the legalization of same-sex marriage. So that's something to note at first, that this was not a popular change that was made. It was actually, not only was it against the popular will of people, but is also against the institutions of Greece did not support it, specifically the church, which is important. Okay, so in 2021, the U.S. State Department launches an initiative to promote LGBT issues worldwide, particularly in conservative countries using taxpayer-funded programs such as USAID. So as a lot of people know, when the United States and Europe want to affect domestic politics in a foreign country, well, they can't often do it blatantly through the use of hard diplomacy. They have to use soft diplomacy. They have to employ NGOs, non-governmental organizations, because one country brazenly affecting the politics of another country is typically looked down upon, both by the people and the state. So that's why USAID was so controversial in Europe. And Trump, whether you like it or not, him actually dismantling it was probably a good thing for Europe in general. A lot of these American and European NGOs have access to American taxpayer dollars through USAID, and they start receiving millions of dollars in funding from the US and the European Union, which is directly to be used for the goal of legalizing same-sex marriage in Greece. Okay, now fast forward to January 2024. Anthony Blinken, the US Secretary of State at the time, travels to Greece to meet with Prime Minister Mitsotakis, where he pressures him to pass a bill legalizing same-sex marriage. Now, reportedly, Blinken told Mitsotakis that the U.S. would not sell the F-35s to the Greek Air Force unless the Greek parliament adopted a same-sex marriage bill. And they also promised Greece, as just to sweeten the deal, a $200 million financial aid package in return for Greece sending armed vehicles to Ukraine. So you have sort of a carrot and a stick here. Here's the actual state of the negotiations. Basically, the U.S. State Department is telling Greece, you have two options. Either we can give you the F-35s so you can maintain a competitive advantage over Turkey in the Eastern Mediterranean, but you have to legalize same-sex marriage. Also, just to sweeten the deal, we'll also give you $200 million if you give some of your weapons to Ukraine. So it's like the carrot and the stick. Either you lose your competitive advantage against Turkey, and we sell them F-35s and you, or you can get $200 million and you legalize same-sex marriage. Okay, so that's sort of the first level of manipulation. So then on February 15th, Greece does legalize same-sex marriage despite the overwhelming public opposition. Like I said, even the most liberal polls showed roughly a 50-50 opposition. Conservative polling actually showed about 80% opposed to the legalization of same-sex marriage. If you aggregate the data, most of the statistics suggest that around 60 to 70% of Greeks were opposed to it. And then finally, to cap it all off, on March 1st, the response from the church came, and they excommunicated all of the MPs who voted for the bill and unanimously declared their opposition to the law. So that's the timeline that I wanted to show you guys. And I'm going to sort of open it up to analysis, but basically, what's the point of me telling you all this? And why did I tell you all of this after we discussed these sort of competing influences in Greece? Well, simply put, Greece is a country which is obviously very beautiful. It's built up a really consistent brand around tourism, and it's become a hub for travel globally. I mean, literally people from all over the world come to Greece to see the statues and to see the ancient ruins and to go to the beach. And like I said, this sort of business, this state of the economy is only possible in a country or with a nation which does not take religion seriously, which does not actually associate with the canons and the traditions of the Orthodox Church, and does not see itself as a people rooted in the soil. Rather, what they want is they want sort of a cosmopolitan hub for travel and tourism that can be basically milked by these foreign investors forever. And again, things like this, maybe the connection isn't quite obvious to some, but to people who understand, again, what has happened to a country like Monaco, what's happened to a country like the Bahamas, what's happened to a country like Costa Rica. Well, they're essentially fake countries with fake economies. Costa Rica has no exports. Monaco has no exports. It has no real native culture. All it has is tourism. It has casinos and, whatever else. And I think that that's the way that Greece is headed. That's why there's such an emphasis on tourism and developing the tourism infrastructure. And the state at the same time is rapidly secularizing. So I know I just talked for a really long time. Hope that was actually that actually made sense. I'm gonna put it up to you to see do you have any thoughts on that? Because I know that was a generational yap sesh.
No, it's okay. Anytime you do a yap sesh, it's always great stuff to hear. I do have a couple of thoughts. I mean, you talk to any non-Greek, and you bring up Greece, always the stereotype, but it's true. The thing you're going to hear is like, oh yeah, I went to Mykonos for my honeymoon, or like, I went to, there's like maybe three islands they could possibly ever mention. And they've definitely, they've been there, and it was great because they say it's great because they went to a bunch of parties on the beach, and I don't know, they probably heard like Mamma Mia or something on like the radio or television or something. And it's like has basically nothing at all to do with actual Hellenic culture or traditions or the people at all. It's totally just like a consumerist fake image, basically.
It's a version of Greece which is characterized only by mythology, ancient Greece, artwork, beaches, and music, and it's not really reflective of the past 2,000 years of Christian Hellenic history and Roman history and the Byzantine art and the Byzantine architecture. And there's a reason why the Acropolis has become the sort of defining image of Greece or of Athens, whereas, beyond our independence, actually what the defining feature of Hellenic achievement would probably be Hagia Sophia, not the Acropolis. And again, you can see the sort of bait and switch that happens with almost every aspect of Greek culture. And it is all intertwined. It is all interconnected. It's about creating a consumer brand which is safe for people to consume and is non-threatening and is not offensive.
I was just reading, you reminded me, just yesterday, I was reading through a little bit of Ellinikos Politismos by Ion Kargoumis, and he mentions in there how the Greeks originally had full intention on going all the way to Constantinople, and that Athens was just the temporary capital. And then over time, he says they forgot about this, and now Athens has become the permanent capital, and they forgot about Constantinople. And that sort of exemplifies it, because, not to hate on Athens, like it's an important part of our history, but that sort of exemplifies how we have this fake image of like ancient Greece, which is like, what does that even mean? Are you talking about Homer? Are you talking about Plato? Are you talking about Alexander? Like, these are all like totally different eras, but they lump it all into one thing. And then it's like, oh, they were like the 12 Olympian gods that they worshipped. And it's like, that's not true. That's not how it worked. And then whatever. And then somehow, like magically at some point, supposedly, we became Orthodox, and Orthodoxy is like a Greek thing or something. And then now it's today. Now it's 2026, and we go on vacation. So
yeah, exactly.
That's basically the conception, and it's ridiculous.
Yeah, totally. And again, like I could sit here all day and complain about Western branding of Greek culture, and I probably will. But the point that I want to make, the very narrow point that I want to make, is that the Greek people are not leaving their history. There is a concerted effort by the powers that be, whatever you want to call them. You can call it international capital. You can call it the United States and American imperialism. You can call it the European Union. Call it whatever you want. But there is an actual concerted effort to separate the Greeks from their traditions, to re-teach a version of Greek history which is inaccurate. And this does sort of tie into what we want to do at KTE, which is to remind the Greek people who they are, to remind the Greek people, especially the diaspora, what their history is. Because, as we said, we do have this sort of fond memory of the Greece of the 1900s, which our grandparents brought over. And that's an important part of our history. And that's arguably when Greece, there's so many historical events that happened, that there's so many heroes, there's so many philosophers, there's so many warriors that existed in this period, memories which our ancestors brought over, which are totally glossed over. That's why you'll only hear about Achilles and you'll never hear about, Pavlos Menas or something like that. Anyways, that's sort of a summary. And I hope that I'm illustrating this properly. And the reason why I think it's important is because if we, as Greek people of the diaspora, don't have a part to play in propagating our history and telling our own stories, then the version of Hellenism that's going to be taught to the world is not going to be one that's actually favorable to us. And it's not going to be one that's accurate. It's not going to be one that's true. And as we've said before, Greeks living abroad are national ambassadors wherever they go. You represent Hellenism and you represent Greece in your everyday life. When you interact with your coworkers, when you talk with your family, when you school, when you're working at your job, whether you realize it or not, you are representing Greece and you are representing Orthodoxy. And I think probably a lot of people who are listening to this can relate. You see in real time when people come to you and they come armed with their misconceptions about Greece, and you have to sort of like have that conversation. Like when someone comes up to you, and it's actually me recently, I'm like a grown-up who still thought that like Greeks worship the Olympian gods. And it's like, it's actually like my responsibility as a Greek to correct that person and explain to them, no, like we're Christian, we've been Christian for 2,000 years, and you should check it out. It's really cool. But like, so this is important, and this is why KTE is doing what it's doing, and this is why we want to talk about these chapters of Hellenic history. We want to talk about these international plans as they exist, so that people can be aware, people can be prepared for what that means for you in your daily life, and what that means for our people, and what that means for our future.
Absolutely. That used to happen to me all the time growing up. I have vivid memories when I was in like elementary school, and people would be like, "Oh, so do you like worship Zeus?" And I'm like, "Well, no, not exactly. No, that's not really not really what it's about." But yeah, I mean, the presentation of the Greek people to the world is totally unconnected from who we actually are as a people, and we're completely disconnected from who we actually are, and we have all these fake presentations of ourselves to the world. And it's no wonder that these powerful people around the world would want to use Greece, because it's so beautiful. It's such a beautiful country, and it's such a great place. And so of course they want to just turn us into their personal resort, because they don't actually care about us or the world or the cultures of the world. Who cares about the cultures of the world? We do. KTE is the number one defenders of the great cultures of the world. But it's really interesting, because the saints of these latter times have talked about how important, some of these issues are, like in terms of sexual identity. The saints talk about this quite a lot in many ways, not just in terms of LGBT, but that's really important, but even with other things too. But they talk about that, and they present it as one of the defining things of like what with salvation, both for our own like personal salvation, but also just as a whole, like of the human race, and just the way things are going to be for people. They say it's one of the most important thing, but so many people kind of want to push it aside, and they want to ignore that stuff. But you can't just ignore the saints. If you have one saint, he says something and is controversial, that's one thing. But when all of the saints are saying the same thing over and over again, for not even just in the 20th century or the 21st century, not just recently, but for all of history, they're all saying the same thing. They all have a consensus. That's when it's like, okay, if you're a faithful Orthodox Christian, then you have to take this seriously, and it has to be important, because they're not just saying things for fun. The saints aren't just bored and they're just like, this would be really funny if I said this. It's not that at all. This is important stuff.
Yeah, no, it's very true. And I think that I think this goes back to KTE's broader thesis, which is that what we're trying to do, or what we're trying to assist in, ultimately, like, we can't do much. We just have to trust in God. But what we're trying to assist in is the re-Christianization of the Greek people, both at home and abroad. And I think this is a really important aspect to it. And I think it stems from the sort of nihilistic attitude that people have adopted in the West, and including in Greece, which has had sort of a lot of Western values pushed on it. And I think what it shows is that, why do we have saints? Like, why does Christ, why does God, like, glorify saints? Well, one of the reasons, of course there are many, but one of the reasons is so that we have a guide, so that we have a reminder of, someone to keep us on the straight and narrow path. What we need to do, I guess, sort of as Hellenes, as Greek Americans, or as Greek Australians, or just Greeks, worldwide, is that we all need to not only heed the warnings of the saints and listen to what they're saying, but also to actively participate in spreading whatever message they chose to give to us, or that God chose to give to us through them. And I do think sexual identity is an important aspect of that. And so are a lot of other contemporary issues that people have a tendency to want to shy away from. It's not because we want to be, laid-back cultural warriors who are, owning the libs and, putting the atheists in their place, but it's because, we reach a point in society where society begins to question the values and traditions that have sustained it for so long. It's happened in the United States, and I think it's happening in Greece right now, where we enter a period where people say, okay, like, what are these traditions? What is this religion? Like, is this really important? Haven't we progressed beyond the need for that? Ultimately, it's very short-sighted, because we know that the reason why that's the foundation of the society that we live in. So to undermine that, we need to undermine society as a whole. But the reason why this happens is because, when problems come about, whether they're spiritual problems, physical problems, the solution to those problems becomes tradition. And there's a reason why these traditions and these dogmas are guarded and sort of propagated by the people or by institutions like the church or the military or the state, because it was important for our survival at one time or another. That's definitely been true about Orthodox Christianity throughout the history of the Greek people. But then, once problem is solved, once the Greek people declare their independence, they keep their identity, they keep their language, they keep their faith, we progress in society to a point where all of the people are like, wait a second, it's like, why do we need that again? Like, why is that here? Isn't this just some antiquated, outdated aspect of a time that's long since gone? And of course, by removing that thing, by removing Christ, or by removing the traditions, or by removing the language or anything else, you invite back in those same problems that had plagued you and that forced you to adopt those things in the first place, right? And so that's why we have to be vigilant about our traditions. We have to be vigilant about our faith. We have to be vigilant about listening to the saints and listening to the Word of God, because there is a reason why we kept it in the past. The reason why it was in a prominent place in our society. And if we remove it, we're literally just going to invite back in the exact same problems that we had before we needed it. Does that make sense?
Yeah, absolutely. There's one of the great saints, I would say, that can really speak to a lot of these ideas is Saint Nikolai Velimirovic from Serbia. He spoke a lot about kind of what we're talking about. He has this one quote when he says, Christ was Europe's God. When this God was banished from politics, art, science, social life, business, education, everybody consequently asked for a God, and everybody thought himself to be a God. So godless Europe became full of gods. And that really shows, I think, sort of where we're at now, because Europe, and not just Europe, but the world, is full of gods. It's full of idols. All these different things that we've basically rejected the teachings of Christ to then say, that's all old-fashioned, we don't need that anymore, and we could replace it with other things. And now we've replaced Christ with other things, and those things have become idols that we now worship. And we think that we're free, but we've actually just enslaved ourselves to passions, which sounds very cliche, but it's absolutely true. And you see that. You can see that in your own life, and you can see that in other people's lives. And, you shouldn't be, speaking of St. Nikolai Velimirovic, he also says that if you want to serve your nation, you need to take care of yourself first. And that's absolutely true. You shouldn't just be going around just pointing things out all the time, saying this person's bad and that person's bad and all this stuff, whatever. You need to look at yourself first and fix yourself. And then from there, you can then serve your nation after that. That's totally true. But sometimes, at least in my experience, I've come across people that I care about. And then sometimes, I can see that they're starting to go down a bad path with different things, whatever it is. Let's say just something simple that I'm sure many people can relate to, like alcohol. Alcoholism is super dangerous, and it's a sin. To be an alcoholic is a sin. But sin, remember, it's not just like breaking, it's not breaking like a rule and then you're like bad because you broke the rule. It's like a sickness, right? Sin is missing the mark. And so people that are trapped in sins need healing. And so sometimes I'll see people who obviously are struggling with alcoholism, and I'll try to help them out, but then they want to reject it. They're like, no, that's not true. I don't have a problem. It's like a meme. It's a joke. I don't have a problem. I can stop anytime I want. And then they don't,
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
But this exemplifies the way that sin acts with people, that you're not actually free. You think, oh, I can drink whenever I want. But no, it's actually this demon that has caught you and said, you're going to drink whenever I tell you to. And that's how all these sins act. Not just that one. That's just, a relatable example. It's everything.
No, yeah, 100%. And I think that again, on a macro level, this thing is happening not only to individuals, but it's happening to society. Where society has convinced itself that it's become more free and it's become more open, when in reality, rather than being subservient to Christ, we're being subservient to our passions, our collective passions of society. We're being, subservient to this sort of like collective sense of pride as a people. And again, yeah, it's like you're right. It is a sickness. And I think the other thing which is important for people to know, which is relevant for our conversation, especially, is that, of course, as Saint Nikolai said, if you want to, you have to help yourself. You have to watch out for yourself first. Like we'll take the plank out of your eye before pointing out the speck in somebody else's. But on that same note, through the individual, the family can be saved. Through the efforts of the individual, it sort of trickles up to your brothers and your sisters and your parents, and then through that, so too can a nation be saved, and then so through that can also all of mankind can be saved. So obviously, it's important for us to focus on ourselves and focus on our personal spiritual life, but more importantly, we have to realize that we are, as individuals, we exist in our relationship with others, and that is not only with our personal relationship, but it's also our relationship to groups of people. You in relation to your nation, it actually matters. And there is a level impact to what you do. And that's why it's important that we are good Christians ourselves. That's why we call ourselves to be that. First we look for ourselves, and then we try to motivate our brothers and sisters in Christ.
100%. And especially, I would say, the Romanian fathers of recent days speak about this a lot, and other fathers too, but especially those saints talked very much about the importance of ourselves and our relation to our nation, the way that we can help bring salvation to the whole nation. And also, I personally am a big fan of Christos Yanaras, and he talks a lot about, personal relationships. And, I highly recommend everyone checking that stuff out. But it's interesting because this idea is actually extremely relevant to the topic of LGBT ideas, because one of the typical things you'll hear from them is they say, like, what does my own business matter to you? Why I'm not affecting you if I can just do whatever I want doesn't affect you. But it actually does, because our own personal state does have an effect on the people around us, and it does affect other people's salvation, because salvation is something that's personable and relational, So, and that's why it's so important to look out for our brothers and sisters, and when you see people falling into these sins, to help them out and be like, hey, like, you got, help set them back on the right path.
Yeah, and this is a disclaimer we probably should have made at the beginning. We're not people who believe that the state should be policing the personal lives of each person, but it's out of a genuine love and care, both for the individual and for their impact on the nation, which informs this desire to remain associated with the traditions of our people, which are antithetical to this sort of revolutionary definition of sexual relationships, which has been foisted upon Greece. And as far as like what can people do about this, and like why does this stuff matter? Like, as we said, obviously, the salvation of other people and the salvation of the nation is dependent on the actions of individuals. Like, that's obviously true. We've established that. But again, like, what are we supposed to do about that? We aren't suggesting that people get thrown in jail and people get beat to death or stoned or thrown off of buildings, because of these sort of because of these sins. Exactly on the contrary, like, we love these people. We want to see them come towards Christ. We want to see them in the kingdom of heaven. And not only that, but we want to see our country heal. We want to see our country become better. And it is important that we talk about these things, and it is important that we take a stand on them. And of course, yeah, like, what does that come from? That comes from love. But we shouldn't just destroy the entire religious foundation and religious consciousness of our entire society because we don't want to offend somebody, or because we don't want to, be too restrictive. No, what we want is strong, healthy Christian nation that involves every single man, woman, and child. We're very romantic, as you can tell. We have dreams and aspirations. So, yeah.
So true. Well, I think we could start to wrap up this conversation for today. I think this is something really important. I think that this is really interconnects with a lot of things that are important to our times. I think if that weren't the case, then the Saints wouldn't talk about it. You know. Um, Alex, do you have any final thoughts you want to say before we finish up here?
Yeah, really quickly, just to tie everything up, because I know that perhaps to the uninitiated, this may seem like we grabbed from a bunch of different corners and tried to tie things together. Because obviously, like, the things that we're talking about are tangentially related to one another. But for someone with like a Christian worldview, for the Orthodox Christian frame of reference, all of these things do make perfect sense. And so I guess to summarize, here's what I want to leave you with. Of course, Greece is a complex country, and our opinions about Greece and about the politics of Greece are obviously, they're multi-layered. But what is important to know, and this is sort of the summary of like this part of the conversation, is that Greece is not a country which is necessarily open to throwing away all of its traditions in order to become more Western and more European. That was something that was foisted upon it. That's number one. Number two is like, why does this matter? Well, the reason why it matters to us, and the reason why we think this is important, is because these things do have an impact on the health of the nation as a whole. And they do have an impact on both everyone's salvation and nation's salvation, but also like what kind of a country we want to live in as a Greeks who live in the diaspora. And then again, I guess to sort of wrap it up, the last thing that I'd say is